Thank you so much, and good morning to everybody here. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. In Australia, we refer to mission-oriented innovation as challenge-led innovation, and I'll be sharing some of what we are learning around how to put this into practice through the work that we've done in Australia, but I'll also draw on international case studies because we've been following things that are happening around the world in this space for about 4 years. So I'll share, and then I very much look forward to a discussion afterwards and learning a bit more about what you're doing in the Basque Country. So let me just see my slides. So I think we started in this work just before the pandemic, and we're all experiencing various kinds of systemic challenges around the world, and we have goals, some of which are global, like the SDGs, but some of which are more national and even regional. And we're really interested in all of the ways that we can approach these challenges, these goals, and we're particularly interested in how we respond, because there's a lot of discussion around mission-oriented innovation. There's a lot of discussion at a theoretical level around how we coalesce politically and in the public sector around these challenges. But what we've found in a lot of the work that we've been involved in is that there's a difference between a theoretical analysis and how we actually start to work on these challenges. We have found this particular framework quite helpful in helping us to think about the nature of challenge-led innovation, because in our context, and I think more broadly, it involves not just exploring what the future might need to happen, but also how we extract ourselves from current realities. So the realities that are in decline are just as important to explore and experiment around as the third horizon in this picture, which is the future that we're all hoping to work towards. So we, like you, have followed the work of Mariana Mazzucato in this space, and I think there's great possibility in the work that she has done. And what we have tried to do in our work is to complement her strategic approach with quite a grounded set of methodologies. We don't propose that there is a methodology or one set of tools or one way to do challenge-led innovation. We're interested in the diversity of ways and really understanding what could work in different contexts, because our learning has been that context and culture and place is really important to help us to explore the ways that we can address these large social challenges in different ways according to what works in different contexts. Overall, I think that we can agree that these challenge-led innovation approaches ask us to be very bold, because we're actually reshaping economic, social, and environmental outcomes. And that means that we are in a transformational mindset. We need to work on the intentionality, so using all government levers and power in order to create that direction. But it also requires us to rethink the role of government. And certainly in our context, that's been the most challenging part, to open up the opportunities for reimagining how does government play a role or multiple roles in this challenge-led innovation space. It also requires us to think about the different kinds of platforms that we might use. We're interested in both technical and technological platforms, but also the social infrastructure and architecture that is around the social use of platforms in order to draw together multiple stakeholders from across sectors to address these challenges, because it can't just be government innovating, it has to be multiple actors innovating in order to address these challenges. And I think one of the things that we've really learned over the last 5 years or so is the importance of a portfolio approach to create a degree of coherence across the innovations that we're fostering in order to address these challenges. So the lessons that we have really focused on over the last 4 years is the importance of having different mindsets, different kinds of institutional arrangements and levers, focusing on the cultural shifts, not just the technical shifts that are needed, because we're actually moving away from a risk management approach to government and innovation towards much more of an experimental approach. And I can't emphasize how important this shift is, and how in a lot of ways, perhaps, and I'm sure this is the case in the Basque Country, that you are much more used to experimental approaches, but certainly in our context, it's a very different mode of working inside government to move to a space where we're actually sharing risks and rewards with civil society and with business and corporations. One of the things that we've seen a lot of is using the language of challenge-led or mission-oriented innovation, but then continuing on with the same methods, the same levers, and the same mindsets. And I think this is a challenge all over the world, that we're replacing language, but not necessarily replacing the way that we're acting and really embedding that in new cultures of government. And lastly, what we've learnt to a large extent is that it only really works if we have a very proactive focus on cross-sector collaboration. So some of the more recent work that we've been involved in is looking really at how do we activate other sectors such as civil society in order to collaborate if government is ready to start to work on cross-sectoral challenge-led innovation. The new roles for government, I think, are important to recognise. So rather than being a market fixer, government becomes a co-creator and a shaper of direction. So we move away from government leading to government co-creating. We move away from an efficiency focus to looking for spillovers, dynamic spillovers, and really creating a sense of public value. And we move away from a management of risk to really an experimentation and a sharing of risks. And I'll come back to this because I think it's a very different role for government. We've been following the work of Audrey Tang in Taiwan, and I think she makes a really important point when they say we not just have to grow more trust in government, but it's really how does government grow the trust in people and civil society and business to be a co-creator rather than just a convener or a fixer. One of the things that I think is really important is there isn't one way of doing this. And so we're very interested in fostering a dialogue, and I'd be very interested to hear from you about the diversity of ways to do this. We can have very top-down driven ways, but I think there are other ways to approach this. And in the work that we've been doing, we've tried to really foster other experimentation with different models, including a lot of place-based work and a lot of design-led work, which are the two areas which I think have achieved good first starting points of moving towards challenge-led innovation. So the anatomy that we use is in our challenge-led innovation approach is that we start with directional goals, and it's a very important distinction between a goal as a destination and a goal as a direction, because it provides the intent and the ambition, but we're less convinced, and this is open to debate, and I'm happy if you ask questions or stimulate some debate. We're less convinced that we can achieve those goals through targets and indicators, because we're mostly working in complex environments. So we have to learn our way forward rather than having a destinational goal. This is a little bit controversial, but it's our experience that a lot of the goal-oriented change processes in complex environments actually get caught up when their targets are too obvious and too focused. And that leads to all sorts of other complications. We then have a series of challenges which set a coherent field of action and are much more action focused, then drop down to portfolios, which I would say are the engine room of innovation, and then the projects. And the idea of this is not for us to religiously follow this as a strategy, but use it as an orientation framework so that we can see the anatomy and the different layers of process that we might need. It is important to note that it isn't a linear framework. So we really need in these approaches, I think, to reflect complexity, and not just in the way that we structure, but in the practice of these sort of approaches. So that's my theory over. I just want to explore what each of these means in practice by just sharing a few examples, both from our own work and from work that we've seen around the world. So talking about that directional goal, I think one of the challenges with the SDGs as goal is that they have been thought of as destinational goals. And so once you start building in targets and really, really tight definitions of those targets and indicators, you can very easily lose track. And as we've seen with a lot of the SDGs, we're struggling to achieve those targets. And they're very complex goals. So trying to justify how we have achieved them through targets can lead to a little bit of misrepresentation of what we're actually achieving. So if we have a look, some of the goals that we're seeing around the world, this is an example from British Columbia in Canada, they're very large goals. So inclusive growth and clean growth, they're extremely ambitious goals. if we try and put targets in there, we reduce them straight away and we start to lose the potential of keeping the ambition alive. The challenges sit below the directional goals, and they're really where it becomes more important that we think about the action and what would create momentum in the direction of those goals. They still need to be inspiring and engaging, and they need to orient us towards this idea of action in response to the goals. Our experience is that this is where it can start to get difficult if we don't match the challenges to what is actually possible in our own contexts. So one of the tools that we use quite a lot is what we call a challenge ikigai, where we ask ourselves in framing the challenges, what do we actually have the capacity to influence as organizations, as levels of government? What other networks can we engage? What are our strengths and capabilities in response to the overall directional goal? And where is the evidence pointing us that there might actually be very real and sensitive intervention points that we could focus on that will give us some wins and again increase the energy and commitment from across sectors? Framing challenges, I think, is one of those things that where we need to orient ourselves practically and ask some questions. So I'm going to give two examples of a design approach to challenges. And the first one comes from Vinnova in Sweden. And as you can see from this image, they actually start with bringing the whole system into the room. So in-depth interactive workshops where they map out in these very large images what's happening, and they identify the leverage points and then look for leverage points that they can build evidence into. And that's how they start to shape their challenges. An example from our own space is that in Australia, one of the big policy areas that government at all levels is exploring is, what does care mean after COVID, and how do we build care economies? And you may be exploring similar sorts of policy areas. In Australia, there's no single agreement about what a care economy might look like. So in shaping challenges around this as a directional goal to build a care economy, first of all, we need to imagine what fields of action there might be in that. So this is a representation of how do we grow the imagination of what is possible, and then put the evidence and the action back into that imagination, so that we're not limiting the fields of action and not restricting ourselves to what is already in play. So like Vinnova, we tend to have a designerly approach to exploring what challenge areas may be. And like Vinnova, we believe that the more participatory you can build this imagining, the more you can involve different sectors, different parts of government into the process of imagining, the more commitment ultimately you can build. Portfolios is the next level down, and this is the area I think that needs we really need to grapple with what do portfolios mean as part of challenge-led innovation, because portfolios have a mixed history. And I think there's a lot of confusion in the mission-oriented innovation world, the challenge-led innovation world, as we call it, between the traditional view of portfolios, which comes from an investment background. And so we often hear portfolios in this mission-oriented, challenge-led world being talked about in the same way as a risk reduction methodology, where we're trying to, spread investment for a maximum return of investment. We don't actually think that this is the role of portfolios in a challenge-led innovation process. For us, the portfolio, because we're working in complex challenge areas, the portfolios need to adopt a learning approach. And so for us, the innovation portfolio is a learning for innovation methodology. So what we're trying to do is maximize learning opportunities and enable effectiveness and efficiency for shared learning, because we're working often in uncertain environments where we have to learn forward. We don't have the luxury of working in spaces where the outcomes and probabilities are really well understood and quantifiable. So if we think about portfolios in that space of learning, we're interested in how do we build an anatomy of a portfolio. So for us, we understand first, what are the learning questions? What is the problem or opportunity space? What do we actually need to learn in our portfolio? And what is the infrastructure that we need to build in order to maximize the effectiveness of learning? And so very often we have multiple projects inside a portfolio that can influence each other and maximize the effectiveness of learning. Let me give you an example, because that all sounds very theoretical. So like you, we are grappling with energy transitions in Australia. And the portfolio approach in this energy area can be extremely valuable if we start to look at what do we focus those portfolios around? What do we actually need to learn? So this is an example of a challenge-led innovation process that's focused on energy transition, where the top level, the directional goal is energy transformation, transition to a low carbon economy, where we've got various challenges that we need to address in order to build momentum, where the portfolios then are around how do we actually make that transformation happen in different spaces. So we need in Australia to rebuild, learn our way into a different kind of energy market. We need to work out what energy efficiency is in a context where, something like 60% of our current houses are not fit for purpose to maximize energy efficiency. We need to transform our energy grids, and that's not just about learning the technical side of the energy grid. It's also primarily learning about how do we build the social infrastructure in order to make those energy grids effective from a community perspective. And then we have lots of experimentation to do around how we build, what our transport and mobility futures are, and how do we actually create a national R&D technology space. Another small example, and I'll try and go quickly here so that we can maximize our discussion time. We have done a little bit of work in the space of circular economy from a challenge-led approach. And one of the areas that we've explored is the recycling of aluminium. So currently Australia is the largest producer of aluminium, but we only recycle about 5 or 6% of our aluminium once we produce it. The rest we ship offshore for recycling. So one of our challenges is to explore how we actually create an inside country circular aluminium economy. So this is a regional challenge map that we've explored. I'd want to dive down into the portfolios though, just to give you an idea. And this is not something that is in practice. It is a provocation that we've put to the aluminium industry and to government around what is it that we actually need to learn in order to increase our aluminium recycling capabilities. And I'll show you here, we have a number of portfolios that we think require innovation. One is around data and collecting data, analyzing data and sharing data. And in here, we have identified core project areas that we need to build into those portfolios to really maximize the use of that data. And again, another portfolio is developing market mechanisms, where we unpack what is it that we need to learn in order to grow the market mechanisms for a circular economy in aluminium. And then we build up the projects that are needed in that we can maximize learning across in order to make an effective market mechanism portfolio. Lastly, there's impact projects, and they are around where the innovation happens in smaller areas. So in those impact projects, usually what we do is to make the innovation happen. So we build prototypes, we test assumptions, we learn what is going to work in relation to particular innovations that we need to grow in that space. Vinnova is a great example of where they've used projects to really test ideas in place. And again, testing ideas in place can grow the commitment of various partners, business and civil society, to work alongside government to make these innovations happen and help us move towards the directional goal. Lastly, I just want to spend a little bit of time exploring what we've learned around creating an enabling environment. So we think that at the heart of an enabling environment really is a different kind of capability and capacity. So, and this has to, I think, start with a different way of government building capability and capacity, because whilst we would like to think that civil society and business can lead challenge-led innovation in the future, we think that government still has a crucial role to play in building the enabling environment for this sort of innovation. So the capabilities and the enabling environment are around the sort of leadership that we have, the way that political infrastructure works, the way that we govern, and the rise of adaptive governance frameworks, the flows of funding and investment, and the way that we create drivers to attract cross-sector actors to participate. So let me just illustrate what I mean by growing capabilities and the governance in particular, because those are the two areas that I think are critical at the current moment here in Australia and in other places that we've seen around the world. So there are numbers of capabilities, I think, that we're seeing government here grapple with, but also that creates some barriers for this work to move forward. The first one is around shaping capabilities, and that really is about the levers that we can use inside government to create opportunities for innovation. And areas that we're seeing are quite difficult for governments is to grapple with technologies and also procurement. So how do we invest differently in order to reshape markets for this sort of transformation? The second area is connecting capabilities, and that is a lot of what Audrey Tang talks about. How do we democratize innovation and invite other sectors, other stakeholders, other institutions to work alongside government and share the risks and rewards? And then the last one is sense-making capabilities. And in that, it really is about how does government learn and learn alongside other actors. So really making the opportunity for direction plus autonomy, learning and feedback that's informed by diverse perspectives. It all sounds very easy, but we find government in Australia, maybe not in the Basque Country, grappling with these capabilities and really changing the internal culture of these areas. In research, the big finding is that a lot of this work is the biggest barrier is skills, methods, and capacity. And we find exactly the same thing. This is a survey that was done in 2021. I can tell you, even in the last week, our experience is that this is still the biggest gap, is how do we build the capabilities inside government in these areas. So just an example of how others are grappling with this, we're quite interested in what has happened in London, where they have started to explore how do we fund the capability of other players and build the capability of government alongside those other players. So they've had lots of open invitation innovation processes, but have a look at what they have identified as capability, looking at evidence-based and evidence building, thinking in systems, shifting power, strengthening resilience, diversifying participation, and focusing on young people. If we zoom out and have a look at how this is different from traditional innovation support, I think what's really important is the diversity and the stretching out of the support that we offer. So rather than funneling down and resourcing individual organisations and focusing on individual ideas, again, it's that portfolio dynamic of, creating intersections, creating opportunities for people to learn together, organisations to learn together, and for ideas to start to connect. So what the learning out of London, and certainly that would be supported by our own work, is to really actively facilitate connection between entities. Lastly, leadership and governance. One of the interesting things that we've found is that there are two theories of action that work in relation to how do we shift challenges and head towards these goals. The first one is still dominant. So it's the structured theory of action where governance rules. So what we see is government sets a direction and a goal. There's challenges, but there's an assumption that we will all plan and align and coordinate and collectively act towards that goal. If we think about the SDGs, this is very much how we structure action towards the SDGs in the dominant paradigm. The second one is different, and it's much more aligned with the challenge-led innovation approach that I've taken you through just now. It's where we set a direction, a directional goal, but we don't pretend that everyone will agree on what the challenges are or agree on what innovation is needed to achieve movement towards the goal. So in this approach, we don't focus on agreement on anything other than the direction of travel. We don't try and govern every level. We let diversity of approaches bloom, and we try and build responses that can help coherence, but not force governance. So in this sort of an approach, we actually distribute leadership and we build a nervous system metaphor of how innovation happens, not a backbone or a hierarchical leadership approach. This is the biggest challenge, I think, for government, because in Australia, government is much more practiced in a structured action approach, much less confident in a networked governance approach or action approach. So if we have again a look at London, they've got one goal, one direction. They've got 9 missions. They've set up both a very traditional hierarchical governance approach in the board, which plans and oversees, but they have a networked approach in the task force where they encourage diversity of initiatives. And I think this connection between a very structured traditional government approach and a much looser, coherent, networked approach is starting to lead to some very positive movements towards their directional goals. If we have a look at British Columbia, again, they've got very large directional goals, tackling inequality and climate change. I'm going to skip this. to have a look at what the recommendations are, because in the review of this, what they were challenged about was exactly this tight, loose connection. So what they were recommended was that they have both the tight political support across parties, but that they start to explore what would operational autonomy look like, so that you have a diversity of approaches. They were also recommended to rethink the way that they silo things. So a structured approach works well if you have silos, because all you have to do is make sure all the silos agree on your overall goal. But in practice, the complexity of the challenges that we're facing mean that we can't work across silos. We need to build a machinery of government that can break down the silos and become more agile. And again, that points to having much more of a networked approach. So governance structures that really break down the silos. And lastly, the nature of governance, to really build capacities for adaptive governance. Governance that has a risk, that encourages risk-taking and experimentation. And in a lot of ways, this is the hardest thing to build back into government, because government is responsible for public monies. So the challenge, I think, is how do we make the practical reality of this diversity of experimentation fit into structures that are much more currently able to cope with, that structured approach to change. In that original survey, silos is the biggest risk that people identified to this challenge area. And so this is the space where innovation needs to be oriented. How do we break down those silos? Oftentimes we think about challenge-led innovation being focused outside onto the external challenges that we're all grappling with. This asks us to turn our innovation inside as well and have a look at how we're structuring that innovation process inside governments. So just to finish with a quote that comes from the original moonshot that Mariana Mazzucato identified and started her journey towards mission-oriented innovation. When we come together, we're greater than the sum of the parts. We become capable of doing what would be considered impossible, and we're better than we ever expected to be. I think what we're learning at the very heart of challenge-led innovation is that the spillovers are great, and they go to the heart of what government is for and how we do government, not just what kinds of directions we can travel in. So thank you very much.